They said, "Get your face in the dirt now." The command was screamed with the kind of artificial intensity they teach you in MP school, shattered the quiet reverence of the morning. Corporal Davies didn't wait for compliance. He drove his knee into the old man's back, forcing him face first into the wet, muddy soil of the overgrown cemetery. Click, click. The handcuffs bit into wrists that were thin and papery, wrists that had once carried a machine gun through the Ashall Valley. "You sick freak," Davies spat, kicking a bucket of soapy water over, sending a scrub brush tumbling into the weeds. "Digging up graves on a federal installation. You're going away for a long time." The old man, Elias, didn't fight. He just turned his head to the side, spitting out a mouthful of mud, his eyes locking onto the tombstone he had been scrubbing, a stone barely visible through the moss. He wasn't crying for himself. He was crying because he hadn't finished the job. He looked at the young corporal, a kid who looked like he was still wet behind the ears, and whispered, "You don't know who is under your feet, son." Davies laughed. "I don't care. To me it's just a pile of rocks, and you're just a trespasser. Folks, this corporal thinks he just caught a vandal. He has no idea he just handcuffed the keeper of the base's darkest secret. And when the base commander finds out whose grave this is, the reckoning is going to be biblical. Stick around." But the heavy, humid air of the Georgia swamp clung to everything like a second skin, a suffocating blanket of heat that made the back of your neck prickle and your uniform stick to your spine. But in the forgotten Sector 4 inches of the base cemetery, the heat was the least of the problems, because this was the place the landscaping contracts forgot, a corner of the installation that had been swallowed by kudzu, briars, and 50 years of bureaucratic neglect. Elias knew this place better than he knew his own apartment. He knew where the ground was soft, he knew where the snakes nested, and he knew exactly where the bodies lay that the modern Corps had stopped visiting. He was 78 years old, a man carved out of teak and leather, moving with a stiff, painful hitch in his hip that was a souvenir from a mortar attack in 1968. But every Sunday, like clockwork, he parked his beat-up sedan on the logging road outside the perimeter fence, climbed through a hole in the wire that he had cut himself, and hiked a mile through the boonies with a backpack full of cleaning supplies, because if he didn't clean these stones, nobody would. He wasn't a vandal, he was a ghostly caretaker, a self-appointed guardian of the dead, who had been left behind when the base expanded and the new cemetery was built on the sunny side of the post. On this particular Sunday, the silence of his labor, the rhythmic scritch-scratch of a wire brush against granite, was broken by the snapping of twigs and the aggressive revving of an ATV engine. Corporal Davies and Private Miller, two MPs on a perimeter patrol that was usually just an excuse to smoke cigarettes and kill time, had spotted the movement in the brush. To them, Sector 4 wasn't hallowed ground. It was a no-go zone, a patch of woods marked on the map as off-limits due to unexploded ordnance risks from the old ranges nearby, or so the rumours said. Davies, a man who polished his boots until they looked like black mirrors, but had never walked a patrol in a combat zone, saw Elias not as a veteran paying respects, but as a threat, a civilian dirtbag who had breached the wire. "Contact front," Davies shouted, killing the engine and leaping off the ATV with his hand on his holster, his adrenaline spiking for all the wrong reasons. "Let me see your hands. Drop the weapon." The weapon in question was a rusted garden trowel Elias was using to clear the moss from the base of a stone. Elias froze, slowly rising from his knees, his hands stained with the black earth of the grave. He didn't drop the trowel immediately. His grip was locked by arthritis and shock. "It's just a trowel, son," Elias said, his voice calm, deep, and carrying the weight of command that doesn't fade with age. "I'm cleaning the lieutenant's stone. It's his birthday." Davies didn't hear lieutenant. He didn't hear birthday. He only heard non-compliance. "I said drop it, or I will drop you." Davies advanced, closing the distance with aggressive strides. while Private Miller, a boot, who looked terrified, hung back, his eyes darting around the creepy overgrown graveyard. You might think Elias is weak, because he's standing there surrounded by weeds, looking like a vagrant. But trust me, you are looking at a man who hunted men for a living before these kids were even DNA. Who isn't afraid of the gun, he's afraid of the history being lost. Elias dropped the trowel. It landed with a soft thud in the mud. I have permission, Elias lied. Or maybe he didn't lie, because in his mind, the permission came from the men buried there, not the base commander. I've been coming here for 10 years. Check the logs. Davies scoffed, kicking the trowel away into the brush. There are no logs for this sector, old man. This is a restricted area. You are trespassing on a federal military installation. Turn around, hands behind your back. The disrespect was palpable, a physical force that hit Elias harder than a punch. He wasn't being treated like a citizen. He was being treated like an insurgent. You're making a mistake, Elias warned, his voice dropping an octave. You need to look at the name on this stone before you cuff me. You need to read it. Davis grabbed Elias's shoulder, spinning him around with unnecessary force, wrenching his arms back. I don't read rocks, Grandpa. I read the UCMJ, and you are in violation of Article 134. You're going for a ride. The cuffs ratcheted tight, pinching the thin skin of Elias's wrists, metal biting into bone. To Davies, it was a collar. To Elias, it was a betrayal. He was being shackled on the very ground he had fought to protect, by the very men who wore the uniform he treasured. The irony was bitter, tasting like copper and dirt in his mouth. Private Miller stepped forward nervously. Corporal? Maybe we should check? He has a tattoo. Look at his arm. Miller pointed to the faded ink on Elias's forearm, a Force Recon skull and paddle, barely visible under the age spots. Davies glanced at it and sneered. So? Probably got it at a pawn shop. Stolen valor is a crime too. Load 'em up. Stories like this matter to guys like us because we know that the uniform doesn't make the Marine, the code does. And right now, Corporal Davis is violating the code in ways he can't even comprehend. Stay with me, because the mud is about to fly. The click of the handcuffs ratcheting tighter around Elias's wrists wasn't just a sound. It was a declaration of war against history itself, a sharp, metallic bite that sent shockwaves of pain up his arthritic arms and into shoulders that had carried the weight of the world since 1968. But Corporal Davies didn't care about the physics of elderly joints. He only cared about the optics of his arrest, yanking Elias up from the mud with a force that would have been excessive for a combatant half his age, causing the old veteran to stumble and nearly face-plant back into the swampy earth he had been tending with such care. Get on your feet, old-timer. Stop resisting, Davies barked, the accusation of resistance laughable to anyone with eyes, since Elias was barely staying upright, his breath coming in ragged, whistling gasps that smelled of stale tobacco and fear, not for himself, but for the desecration happening right before his eyes. As Elias regained his balance, mud dripping from his white stubble and staining his faded flannel shirt, he watched in horror as Davies turned his attention back to the grave site, kicking the bucket of cleaning water over completely, sending a slurry of soap and swamp muck washing over the small American flag Elias had planted in the soft earth just moments before. Look at this garbage, Davies sneered, looking at Private Miller, who was hanging back, looking pale and uncertain. This guy turns a restricted zone into a landfill. Plastic flags, dead flowers, scrub brushes. It's disgusting. Hey, Miller, bag this evidence up. We're charging him with defacing government property and littering on a federal installation. This is where most men would crack. This is where the indignation would spill over into screaming or begging. But Elias, he's built different. He didn't say a word. He just watched the soapy water soak into the ground, his eyes burning with a cold blue fire. Miller hesitated, looking from the angry corporal to the silent old man, his gut telling him this was wrong, foobar in the worst way, because he saw the way Elias was standing, head up, chin out, despite the cuffs, a posture you don't learn on the street, you learn on the yellow footprints of Paris Island. Corporal, Miller murmured, his voice cracking, maybe we just issue a warning. I mean, he was cleaning it. The stone looks older than the base. Davies whipped around, his face flushing red, the heat in his own ego cooking his brain. Did I ask for your opinion, Private? I gave you an order. Bag the trash and grab that trowel. It's a weapon used in the commission of a crime. Davies turned back to Elias, getting right in his face, close enough that Elias could smell the energy drink on his breath and see the absolute lack of soul in his eyes. You think this is funny? You think the rules don't apply to you because you're geriatric. But let me tell you something about the real world. Pop, nobody cares about your little hobby. This land belongs to the United States Marine Corps, and right now I am the Marine Corps. He poked a finger hard into Elias's chest, right over the spot where his heart was hammering a dangerous rhythm. You are going to take a ride in the back of the cage, and then you are going to sit in a holding cell until the Provost Marshal decides if he wants to prosecute or just ban you from the base for life. Either way, you are never stepping foot in these woods again. If this disrespect makes your blood boil, you're in the right place, because watching a man who thinks he is the Marine Corps abuse the man who actually built it is the definition of a tragedy. Davies grabbed Elias by the arm, digging his fingers into the bicep, and began to frog march him toward the ATV parked on the logging trail, pushing him through the briars and the wait-a-minute vines that snagged on Elias's clothes and tore at his skin. Elias stumbled, his bad hip screaming in protest, his boots catching on the roots. But he didn't cry out, he just bit his lip until he tasted iron, focusing on the pain to keep his mind sharp, to keep the flashback at bay. Slow down, Elias wheezed. My leg, shrapnel, doesn't bend right. Davies laughed, a cruel short bark. Tell it to the VA. Move it. They reached the vehicle, a Polaris RZR outfitted for patrol, and Davies didn't open the door gently. He shoved Elias into the back seat, a cramped metal cage designed for gear, not prisoners, forcing the old man to contort his body to fit, his head banging against the roll bar with a sickening thud. Watch your head, Davies said sarcastically, slamming the mesh door shut and latching it. Elias sat there, hunched over, his hands numb behind his back, the mud drying on his face, looking out through the wire mesh at the jungle that had been his sanctuary for a decade. He watched Miller pick up the trash, the flag, the brush, the half-empty bottle of bleach, and throw it into the cargo bed like it was refuse. That bottle of bleach had cost Elias $3, a significant amount for a man on a fixed pension, but it was the flag that hurt the most. It was a flag he had bought at the exchange 5 years ago, a flag that had flown over that grave through hurricanes and heat waves. Now it was evidence. Davies jumped into the driver's seat, revving the engine aggressively, looking in the rearview mirror at his prisoner. Hope you got good shocks in that hip, old-timer. It's a bumpy ride back to civilization. He slammed the vehicle into gear and punched the throttle, the tires spinning in the mud, throwing rooster tails of sludge into the air as the ATV lurched forward, bouncing violently over the ruts and roots of the unmaintained trail. Elias was thrown side to side, his shoulders slamming against the metal frame, his teeth rattling in his skull, every bump sending a jolt of agony up his spine. But he didn't give Davies the satisfaction of a groan. He closed his eyes and visualized the map. He knew exactly where they were going. They were heading to the Provost Marshal's office, PMO, at the main precinct, the heart of the shiny base, a place of air conditioning and computers and officers who looked at spreadsheets instead of soldiers. He was about to be processed like a common criminal. You might think this is just a rough ride, but for Elias, this is a forced march into enemy territory. He is being taken away from his post. And folks, the anger building inside him isn't hot anymore. It's turning into cold, hard steel. The ride lasted 20 minutes, a grueling gauntlet of physical abuse, disguised as transport, until the jungle gave way to pavement. The canopy opened up to reveal the stark, ugly buildings of the modern base, and the ATV slowed down as they entered the populated areas. Young Marines walking on the sidewalk stopped to look at the vehicle passing by, seeing the old man in the back cage, looking like a captured insurgent. Elias saw them staring. He saw the confusion in their eyes. Who is that? Why is an old civilian in the cage? He felt the shame burning his cheeks, not for his actions but for the spectacle. He was a Marine. He was Force Recon. He was a legend in circles. These kids didn't even know existed. And now he was the Sunday entertainment. Davies pulled the ATV up to the rear loading dock of the PMO, braking hard enough to throw Elias forward against the mesh again. End of the line, Davies announced, jumping out. Miller, grab his stuff. I'll haul him in. Davies opened the cage and grabbed Elias by the collar of his flannel shirt, hauling him out like a sack of potatoes. Elias's legs were stiff, refusing to work for a second, and he collapsed to his knees on the concrete. Get up, Davies shouted, looking around to see if anyone was watching, embarrassed by the old man's frailty. Quit faking it. He hauled Elias up, half dragging him toward the steel door of the precinct. Inside, the air was freezing cold, a shock to the system after the swamp heat, smelling of floor wax and coffee. The fluorescent lights were blindingly bright, humming with a frequency that made Elias's head throb. They passed the dispatch desk, where a sergeant looked up from his computer, frowning. What do you got there, Davies? The sergeant asked, eyeing the muddy, handcuffed old man. Caught a trespasser in Sector 4, Davies announced proudly, puffed up like a rooster. Digging around in the restricted zone, had a weapon, resisted arrest. Full package. The sergeant raised an eyebrow. A weapon? That guy? Davies slapped the trowel onto the counter. Garden tool, sharp edge, could have stabbed me. The sergeant looked at the trowel, then at Elias, then back at Davies, clearly skeptical but not willing to undermine a corporal in front of a prisoner. Book him, put him in holding cell 2. It's empty. And Davies, wash him off before you fingerprint him. He's getting mud all over my deck. Davies rolled his eyes. Roger that. Come on, Grandpa. He shoved Elias down the hallway, past the interrogation rooms, toward the holding cells. The disrespect was total. Elias was being erased. His history, his rank, his dignity, stripped away, layer by layer, until he was just a number in a logbook. But as Davies pushed him into the cold concrete cell and unclicked the handcuffs, leaving Elias rubbing his bruised wrists, the old man finally spoke. He looked Davies dead in the eye, his gaze steady and terrifyingly calm. You took me away from him, Elias whispered. You left him alone in the dark, and for that, God help you when the general finds out. Davies laughed, slamming the heavy steel door shut, the sound echoing like a gunshot. Yeah, tell it to the wall. He locked the door. Elias was alone. The bully thinks he's won. He thinks he's locked away a problem. He has no idea. He just locked himself in a cage with a tiger. He just doesn't know it yet. Stay tuned, because the silence in that cell is about to get very loud. To sit in a holding cell at the age of 78 is a specific kind of indignity, a cold, sterile humiliation that seeps into the bones faster than the damp of the swamp ever could. But Elias didn't feel the chill of the concrete bench or the throbbing ache in his wrenched shoulders because his mind had already engaged the escape mechanism he had perfected in a bamboo cage in 1969, a psychological retreat where the walls dissolved and the fluorescent hum was replaced by the chaotic symphony of the past. He sat there staring at the scuffed linoleum floor, but he wasn't seeing the tile. He was seeing the face of the man beneath the moss in Sector 4, a face that had remained eternally 24 years old, while Elias had withered into a ghost of his former self. The corporal, that high-speed kid with the shiny badge and the empty soul, had called the grave garbage, had called the site abandoned, and in a bureaucratic sense, he was right because the base maps had been redrawn in the 90s, the archives had been purged of redundant plots, and the jungle had reclaimed the resting place of the first recon legends who didn't make it to Arlington, but in the spiritual geography of Elias's world, that 6x3 patch of earth was the center of the universe. It was the anchor that kept him tethered to sanity. The name on the stone, First Lieutenant Thomas Tomahawk Sterling, wasn't just a name. It was a debt that could never be repaid, a ledger written in blood that Elias balanced every Sunday with a wire brush and a bottle of bleach. There's a reason he isn't fighting back yet, folks. There is a reason he let them cuff him. It's because deep down in the darkest part of his heart, Elias believes he belongs in a cage. He believes he is serving a life sentence for the crime of survival. You see, the modern Marine Corps teaches you to move on, to process the trauma, to seek counseling, and that's all good and fine for the new generation. But guys like Elias were cut from a different cloth, a rougher fabric that held on to stains forever. He carried the survivor's guilt like a rucksack that never gets lighter. Every breath he took was a breath he stole from the lieutenant. Every sunrise he saw was a sunrise Thomas Sterling missed. The grave wasn't just a memorial. It was a confessional booth. Cleaning it was his penance. When Davies kicked over that water, he didn't just make a mess. He interrupted a prayer. Elias closed his eyes, leaning his head back against the cinder block wall, and traced the timeline of how he ended up here. He remembered the day the base surveyors came through Sector 4 20 years ago, holding blueprints for a new artillery range buffer zone. He remembered standing there, a younger but still old man, arguing with a colonel who told him, "We can't maintain every single plot, Sergeant. We have to prioritize active assets." That was the day the official maintenance stopped. That was the day Elias took the oath of the caretaker. He bought the supplies with his disability check. He cut the hole in the fence because the main gate required a pass he couldn't always get. He became a criminal to be a patriot. The irony was thick enough to choke on. The corporal thought Elias was disrespecting the corporal by trespassing, but Elias was the only one keeping the corporal's soul alive in that sector. He thought about the flag Davies had bagged as evidence. That flag had been flown over the lieutenant's childhood home, sent to Elias by the lieutenant's widow before she passed away in the 80s. It was a holy relic. And now it was sitting in an evidence locker next to drug paraphernalia and stolen hubcaps. The rage flared up again, hot and sharp, but Elias tamped it down. He couldn't lose control. If he lost control, he dishonored Thomas. He had to be the stone. He had to be the silence. You might think the old man is weak because he isn't screaming for a lawyer, but trust me, he is fighting a war inside that cell that is louder than any artillery barrage. He is fighting the urge to give up. He looked at his hands, the knuckles swollen and scarred, the fingernails still black with the grave dirt. Those hands had killed men. Those hands had saved men. And now those hands were useless, shackled by a system that had forgotten its own history. He wondered if the general, the base commander, even knew Sector 4 existed. Probably not. The new generals were managers, politicians in uniform, worried about budgets and PR. They didn't walk the perimeter. They didn't know that the bones of the men who invented their tactics were rotting under kudzu vines a mile from their air-conditioned offices. Or maybe this general was different. Elias had heard rumors. General Sterling. The name had caught his ear when the change of command happened last month. Sterling. It was a common enough name. but every time Elias heard it, his heart skipped a beat. Could it be? No, it was impossible. The lieutenant's son was just a baby when it happened, a baby named Michael. This general was Michael Sterling. Elias had been too afraid to check, too afraid to hope, too afraid to approach the headquarters and ask. He preferred the ghost he knew to the living reality he feared, because if the general was the son, then Elias would have to look him in the eye. And how do you look a man in the eye when you are the reason his father never came home? That was the terror. That was the real prison. Elias took a deep breath, the stale air of the cell filling his lungs. He was trapped, caught between the arrogance of the corporal and the potential judgment of the general. He was an old dog who had finally been caught chasing cars. But as he sat there feeling the throbbing in his hip, a strange resolve settled over him. They had arrested him. Good, they had made a record of it. Good, because now the truth was going to come out. The secret of Sector 4 wasn't a secret anymore. They had dragged it into the light. And if Elias had to go down, if he had to go to federal prison for scrubbing a tombstone, then so be it. But he was going to make sure that everyone from the private to the general knew exactly whose grave they had desecrated. He wasn't guarding a stranger, he was guarding the tomahawk. And the tomahawk didn't take kindly to disrespect. Moments like this deserve to be remembered, because they are the pivot point. The corporal thinks he locked up a vagrant. He's about to find out he locked up the keeper of the keys. And when the door opens, the history lesson is going to be violent. Elias began to hum, a low rhythmic hum. The Marine's hymn, slow, mournful. It echoed off the concrete walls, a haunting sound coming from the criminal in cell 2. The sergeant at the desk down the hall paused his typing to listen, a shiver going down his spine. It sounded like a funeral dirge, and in a way it was. It was the funeral for Corporal Davies's career, though the boy didn't know it yet. Elias was ready. He waited for the door to open. He waited for the question. He waited for the ghost to enter the room. The corporal, that high-speed kid with the shiny badge and the empty soul, had called the grave garbage, had called the site abandoned, and in a bureaucratic sense, he was right, because the base maps had been redrawn in the 90s, the archives had been purged of redundant plots, and the jungle had reclaimed the resting place of the first recon legends who didn't make it to Arlington, but in the spiritual geography of Elias's world, that 6x3 patch of earth was the center of the universe. It was the anchor that kept him tethered to sanity. The concrete floor of the holding cell didn't feel like concrete anymore. It felt like the spongy, rotting floor of the Ashol Valley. That thick layer of decaying vegetation and red mud that sucked the boots right off your feet and smelled of copper and ancient death, because Elias wasn't sitting in Georgia in 2024. He was back in the suck, back in a place where time didn't move in hours, but in heartbeats and frantic radio calls. The hum of the fluorescent lights morphed into the deafening, insect-screaming silence of the triple canopy jungle, a silence that was a lie, a predator holding its breath before the strike. He was 22 again, a sergeant with knees that worked and hands that didn't shake, carrying an M16 that felt like an extension of his own arm. But the weight on his chest wasn't just the flak jacket, it was the crushing realization that they were completely and utterly FUBAR. They were a 6-man recon team, call sign Havoc, and they had walked into a hornet's nest the size of a city block. The heat was a physical enemy, a wet blanket that wrapped around your face and tried to smother you, soaking your fatigues until they were heavy as lead. But the sweat running down Elias's back was cold, the ice water sweat of the pucker factor, when you know the Reaper is standing right behind you. He left a piece of his soul back there, buried in that mud. Keep listening, because that piece is about to come back and explain why a trowel is a weapon and a grave is a commandment. To his left, barely visible through the elephant grass, was the Lieutenant Thomas Tomahawk Sterling. Sterling wasn't like the other officers. He didn't care about the shiny brass or the politics. He was a Mustang, an enlisted man who had earned his commission the hard way, and he moved through the jungle like smoke. Sterling was looking at the map, his face painted in tiger stripes of grease and loam, his eyes scanning the tree line with a calm intensity that anchored the terrified men around him. "Sarge," Sterling whispered, the sound barely audible over the blood rushing in Elias's ears. "We got movement on 3 sides. They're closing the box. We need to punch a hole, or we're going to be permanent residents." The calm in his voice was terrifying because it meant he had already done the math, and the math was bad. They were outnumbered 10-1. The extraction bird, the angel on shoulders, was 10 mics out, which might as well have been 10 years in a firefight. And then the world ended. It didn't start with a shout. It started with the distinct thump of a mortar leaving a tube. "Incoming," Elias screamed, diving for the root system of a massive banyan tree, dragging the radio operator, a kid named Jenkins, down with him. The ground erupted. The shockwave punched the air out of their lungs, turning the world into a kaleidoscope of brown dirt, grey smoke and red mist. The noise was beyond sound. It was a physical pressure that shattered thought. Then came the small arms fire, the crack, crack, crack of AK-47s cutting through the bamboo like a scythe, the green traces floating through the air like angry wasps. Elias returned fire, spraying the green wall, shouting orders that nobody could hear. "Jenkins, get the bird, get the bird!" But Jenkins wasn't moving. Jenkins was gone, slumped over the handset, the radio hissing static. Elias grabbed the handset, his hands slick with blood that wasn't his, screaming into the void. "Havoc 620 station. We are black on ammo. We are taking heavy fire. Broken arrow. I repeat, broken arrow." The radio crackled back, a pilot's voice, calm and detached. "Havoc, this is Dustoff. We see the smoke. It's too hot. We can't sit down. You need to move the LZ over." If you believe sacrifices like this should never be forgotten, stay with this story, because what the lieutenant does next is the definition of the burden of command. Sterling crawled over to Elias, dragging his bad leg. He had taken a round in the thigh, the blood turning his trouser leg black. He looked at the dead radio operator, then at the terrified faces of the 3 surviving men. He looked at the sky where the choppers were circling, unable to land through the wall of lead. He looked at Elias, and he smiled. It was a sad, tired smile. "They can't land, Elias," Sterling said, his voice flat. "Not with that heavy gun on the ridge. Someone has to knock it out. Someone has to draw their fire, so the bird can drop." Elias shook his head, panic rising in his throat. "No, sir. We move together. We fight out together." Sterling grabbed Elias's vest, pulling him close, their foreheads touching in the mud. "Listen to me, Sergeant. That's an order. I'm going to flank the ridge. I'm going to pop smoke. When they turn the gun on me, you get the boys on that bird. You get them home." Elias tried to push him back. "You're hurt, LT. I'll go. Let me go." Sterling slapped Elias's helmet, a sharp ringing sound that focused the world. "You have a life, Elias. You have a girl back in Macon. I saw the picture. Me, I just have the call. That was a lie." Elias knew it was a lie. Sterling had a wife. He had a baby boy named Michael, who had just turned 1. Elias opened his mouth to scream the truth, to remind him of the baby, but Sterling was already moving. He handed Elias his dog tags, the cold metal pressing into Elias's palm. "Give these to Mary," Sterling whispered. "Tell Mikey, tell him his old man stood fast." And then he was gone. The lieutenant didn't run. He charged. He stood up in the kill zone, a lone figure against the green hell, firing his M16 from the hip, screaming a challenge that drew the enemy's eyes and their guns away from the pinned squad. "Get some," Sterling roared, drawing the fire like a lightning rod. The heavy machine gun on the ridge turned, the tracers shifting toward the crazy American officer charging the hill. Elias watched through the tears and the smoke. He saw Sterling take a hit, stumble, get back up, keep firing. He left a piece of his soul back there. Keep listening, because that piece is about to come back. Go now! Sterling screamed over his shoulder. One last command. Elias didn't want to move. Every fiber of his being wanted to run to his lieutenant, to die beside him. But the discipline, the hardwired, ironclad discipline of the NCO, took over. He grabbed the other two survivors. Move to the chopper! Go, go, go! They ran! They ran through the mud, their lungs burning, their legs pumping, while behind them the war concentrated on one man. The chopper flared, the door gunners laying down a wall of suppression. Elias threw the survivors on board and scrambled up the ramp. He looked back, he saw the ridge, he saw the lieutenant make it to the bunker, he saw him pull the pin on a grenade, he saw him jump inside. Boom! A white flash, a dull thud. The machine gun went silent. The chopper lifted off, the G-force pushing Elias into the floor. But he crawled to the door, looking down at the smoking hole in the jungle where his friend, his leader, his brother had just erased himself from the earth to save 3 miserable grunts. Elias clutched the dog tags in his hand so tight they cut his skin. He didn't feel relief. He felt a sickness, a dark, heavy stone settling in his gut that would never go away. He survived, but he didn't live. Not really. The flight back was silent. The other men were crying, praying. Elias just stared at the jungle floor drifting away, whispering the promise over and over again. I'll tell him. I'll tell him. When they finally recovered the body days later, there wasn't much left. They shipped him home in a closed casket. They buried him in the family plot on the edge of the base, back when the base was smaller and the woods were peaceful. Elias stood at the funeral, watching the widow weep, watching the baby boy play with the flag, oblivious to the cost. He tried to speak to them, but the words stuck in his throat. Shame choked him. He just stood in the back, saluting, and made a silent vow to the grave. I will watch over you. As long as I have breath, you will not be forgotten. You will not be overgrown. You will be perfect. That was 50 years ago. The widow died. The boy moved away. The base expanded. The fence went up. The world moved on. But Elias didn't. He kept the watch. He fought the vines. He fought the moss. He fought the snakes. And today, for the first time in half a century, he had failed. He was in a cell. The grave was dirty. The promise was broken. The memory faded. The jungle sounds replaced by the hum of the precinct. But the feeling, the crushing weight of the debt, was heavier than ever. Elias opened his eyes in the cell. He looked at his hands. They weren't holding a rifle anymore. They were empty. But the mission hadn't changed. He had to get back to Sector 4. He had to finish the job, because if he didn't, the lieutenant died for nothing. And that was unacceptable, and acceptable as he'd accept, while Elias sat in the freezing silence of holding cell 2, humming the hymn of his brotherhood to the concrete walls. The machinery of the provost marshal's office churned on with the indifferent efficiency of a slaughterhouse, specifically at the main intake desk, where Corporal Davies was currently hunting and pecking his way through an arrest report, embellishing the narrative with the creative license of a fiction writer to justify the rough treatment of a 78-year-old man. Davies was feeling good, feeling high speed, because in his mind he had secured the perimeter and neutralized the threat, but sitting across from him, watching the young corporal with the weary, heavy-lidded eyes of a man who had seen too many boots make too many mistakes, was Master Sergeant Kowalski, the watch commander, a man whose rack of ribbons was so thick it looked like armor plating, and whose coffee mug was older than Davies' entire military career. Kowalski was old cool, the kind of NCO who could tell if a Marine was lying just by the way he tied his boots. And something about this arrest, The trespasser in Sector 4-inch's story was itching at the back of his brain like a mosquito bite he couldn't scratch. He looked at the pile of evidence Davies had dumped on the counter: a rusted garden trowel, a bottle of cheap bleach, a scrub brush with bristles worn down to the nub, and a plastic evidence bag containing a wet, muddy, folded American flag. Kowalski reached out, his thick fingers drumming on the counter, and pulled the evidence bag closer, peering through the plastic. It wasn't a cheap, made-in-China stick flag you buy at a parade. The fabric was heavy cotton, the stitching was intricate, and even through the mud, he could see the embroidery on the hem, a date, 1968. Kowalski frowned, the pucker factor in his gut rising slightly. "Dovies," Kowalski grumbled, his voice sounding like gravel in a blender. "You said this guy was vandalizing the site? Trashing it?" Davies didn't look up from his typing. "Roger that, Master Sergeant." Digging holes, spilling chemicals, had this flag stuck in the mud like some kind of protest. Real nut job. Kept rambling about permissions and officers. Kowalski didn't like it. Vandals don't use scrub brushes, and they certainly don't fold flags before they get arrested, even if they are crazy. He picked up the intake form Davies was filling out. "Name Elias Vance," Kowalski read aloud, the name rolling around in his head, shaking loose a memory from the base archives. A story about a force recon team that got chewed up in the Ashell Valley. He looked at the location of arrest. Sector 4, Plot 12 Alpha. Kowalski froze. He knew the grid maps. Sector 4 was the Lost Cemetery, the old grounds that were decommissioned before the new highway was built. Nobody went back there. It was snake country. "Who is buried in Plot 12 Alpha, Corporal?" Kowalski asked, his tone sharpening. Davies shrugged, leaning back in his chair with a smug grin. "Some old officer. Sterling, Thomas Sterling. Probably some desk jockey from the Cold War. Who cares? The guy was trespassing. The bully thinks he's won. He thinks he's just filing paperwork. He has no idea that he just pulled the pin on a grenade that is sitting right on his desk. Don't go anywhere, because the explosion is going to be silent and deadly." Kowalski went rigid. The air in the room seemed to drop 20 degrees instantly. "Say that name again," Kowalski whispered, standing up slowly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. Davies looked confused, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. "Sterling. Thomas Sterling. Why?" Kowalski didn't answer. He walked over to the wall where the official chain of command photos were hung. The President, the Secretary of Defense, the Commandant, and the base commander. He pointed a shaking finger at the portrait of the two-star general commanding the installation, Major General Michael Sterling. "You idiot," Kowalski hissed, his face turning a shade of purple that was truly terrifying. "You absolute unmitigated boot." Davies stood up, offended. "Excuse me, Master Sergeant." Kowalski grabbed the arrest report and slammed it onto the desk. "Do you know who Michael Sterling's father was? Do you know why the general is stationed here? He requested this base specifically because his father is buried in the old sector. He's been trying to locate the exact plot for a month, but the records were lost in the '98 flood." Davies went pale, the blood draining from his face as the realization hit him like a sniper round. "Wait, you mean..." Kowalski leaned in, his nose inches from the corporal's face. "I mean, you just arrested a man for cleaning the grave of the general's father, and you bagged the general's family flag as evidence." The silence that followed was absolute, a vacuum of terror that sucked the oxygen right out of the room. Davies looked at the evidence bag, he looked at the holding cell door, he looked at his career, which was currently circling the drain. "Oh God," Davies whispered. I thought he was a bum. I dragged him through the mud, Master Sergeant. I cuffed him hard." Kowalski closed his eyes, rubbing his temples. "You dragged him, you cuffed him." "He resisted," Davies pleaded, his voice rising in panic. "He wouldn't drop the trowel." "Shut up," Kowalski snapped. "Just shut up." He reached for the phone, his hand hovering over the receiver. He had a choice. He could bury this. He could release the old man, apologize, and hope the general never found out. But Kowalski was a Marine. He lived by a code, and he knew that if Elias Vance was who he thought he was, the Sergeant Vance from the citations, then this was a sin that couldn't be buried. But fate, as it often does, decided to intervene before Kowalski could even dial. The double doors of the precinct swung open with a rush of hot air, and a frantic captain, the general's aide-de-camp, burst in, looking flustered. "Master Sergeant, attention on deck." Kowalski and Davies snapped to attention, their heels clicking together. But it wasn't just the captain. Walking in behind him, looking immaculate in his service alphas, holding a map case and looking frustrated, was Major General Michael Sterling himself. He had been touring the perimeter, looking for the very access road Davies had used. The general stopped in the middle of the room, sensing the tension, his eyes sweeping over the frozen Marines. "At ease," Sterling commanded, his voice deep and authoritative, the same voice Elias had heard in the jungle 50 years ago, passed down through DNA. "Master Sergeant, my aide tells me your patrol logs show activity in Sector 4 today. I'm looking for an access point to the old cemetery. Did your men find a route? The bully thinks he can hide. He prays the floor will open up, but the general is staring right at the evidence bag. Watch what happens when the pieces click together." Davies was trembling so hard his belt buckle was vibrating. Kowalski swallowed hard, stepping forward. He couldn't lie. "Sir," Kowalski said, his voice steady but heavy with dread. We did have a patrol in Sector 4, sir. Corporal Davies here made an arrest." The general raised an eyebrow, stepping closer to the desk. "An arrest in the condemned sector. Who goes back there? Poachers." Sterling's eyes drifted down to the counter. He saw the dirty trowel. He saw the bleach. And then his gaze locked onto the plastic bag. He froze. He reached out, his hand shaking slightly, and picked up the bag. He stared at the wet, muddy lump of fabric inside. He saw the date embroidered on the hem, 1968. The general's breath hitched. He knew that flag. He had seen photos of it flying on his mother's porch. He had looked for it in her attic after she died. But it was gone, given away, she had said, to the man who saved us. Sterling looked up, his eyes wide, his composure cracking. "Where did you get this?" he whispered. "Whose flag is this?" Davies couldn't speak. He was paralyzed. Kowalski stepped in, delivering the coup de grace. "It belongs to the suspect, sir. Mr. Elias Vance. He was found cleaning a grave in plot 12 Alpha." The general dropped the map case. It hit the floor with a loud slap. "Vance?" Sterling choked out. "Elias Vance is here? Alive?" "He's in holding cell 2, sir," Kowalski said softly. "He was arrested for trespassing on your father's grave." The general's head snapped toward Davies. The look on his face wasn't anger. It was a mix of horror and disbelief. "You arrested him?" Sterling asked, his voice rising. "You arrested the man who carried my father's body out of the Ashal Valley. You arrested the man my mother prayed for every night for 20 years. Davies made a small squeaking sound. "Sir, I didn't know. He looked like a vagrant. He was digging." "Open the door," Sterling commanded. And now the anger was there. A cold, white-hot fury. "Open the damn door. Now!" Davies scrambled for the keys, fumbling with them, dropping them, picking them up, his hands useless blocks of ice. The general didn't wait. He grabbed the keys from the corporal's hand and marched toward the holding cells, his stride long and purposeful, tearing off his uniform jacket as he walked, throwing it on the floor, because he wasn't going in there as a general. He was going in there as a son. Kowalski watched him go, then looked at Davies, who was standing there, a dead man walking. "You better pray, son," Kowalski whispered. "You better pray that old man has a forgiving heart, because if he doesn't, You're going to Leavenworth. The general reached cell 2. He jammed the key into the lock. He threw the bolt. The heavy steel door swung open, revealing the small, dim room where Elias Vance sat on the concrete bench, covered in mud, his head bowed, humming a song that only the two of them, the general and the prisoner, truly understood. The collision had arrived. The reckoning was here, and the silence in that cell was about to be broken by a sound that would echo through the entire base. I'm looking for an access point to the old cemetery. Did your men find a route? The bully thinks he can hide. He prays the floor will open up. But the general is staring right at the evidence bag. Watch what happens when the pieces click together. Davies was trembling so hard. His belt buckle was vibrating. Kowalski swallowed hard. Stepping forward, he couldn't lie. Sir, Kowalski said, his voice steady but heavy with dread. The heavy steel door swung open with a screech of unoiled hinges that sounded like a scream in the dead silence of the precinct, flooding the dim holding cell with the harsh fluorescent light of the hallway, causing Elias to squint and raise a muddy hand to shield his eyes. But even through the glare, he saw the silhouette standing in the frame, a silhouette that hit him in the gut with the force of a physical blow, because for a split second, in his exhausted and dehydrated state, he didn't see a general. He saw the ghost of Thomas Sterling standing there, tall, broad-shouldered, with that same aggressive stance that said, "I am the storm," and Elias actually flinched, shrinking back against the cold cinder block wall, thinking that the dead had finally come to collect the debt. General Michael Sterling didn't march into the cell. He stepped in slowly, almost reverently, like he was entering a cathedral rather than a drunk tank. His eyes adjusting to the gloom until they locked onto the figure huddled on the bench, a man covered in swamp muck, his flannel shirt torn at the shoulder, his wrists bright red and chafed raw where the handcuffs had bitten into the skin. The general stopped 3 feet away, the air leaving his lungs in a sharp hiss as the reality of the situation crashed into him. This wasn't a perp. This wasn't a trespasser. This was the man who had held his father's head while the life drained out of him. The man who had kept a promise to a widow for 50 years while the rest of the world forgot. Elias lowered his hand, his blue eyes finally focusing on the face of the man in front of him, seeing the stars on the collar, seeing the grey at the temples, but mostly seeing the eyes, those piercing, undeniable, sterling blue eyes that looked exactly like the ones that had closed forever in the Ashal Valley. "Lieutenant," Elias whispered, his voice cracking, the confusion of the past and present blurring together. I tried to clean it, sir. I tried, but they stopped me. I told you justice was coming." Watch the look on the general's face as the most powerful man on the base realizes he is standing in the presence of a giant. General Sterling didn't speak immediately. He couldn't, because the lump in his throat was the size of a grenade. He looked at the mud on Elias's face, the mud from his own father's grave, and the rage that had propelled him down the hallway evaporated, replaced by a wave of sorrow so profound it nearly brought him to his knees. And then he did exactly that. The 2-star general, the commander of 20,000 Marines, ignored the mud on the floor, ignored the sharpness of the concrete, and dropped to both knees, right in front of the bench, bringing his eye level down to match Elias's. He reached out with trembling hands, hands that had signed deployment orders and billion-dollar contracts, and gently, so gently, took Elias's bruised hands in his own. "Sergeant Vance," Sterling choked out, his voice thick and wet. "It's me. It's Mikey. It's the baby boy." The words hit Elias like a defibrillator paddle. Mikey, the name from the jungle, the name on the dog tags, the name he had whispered to the grave 1,000 times. Elias stared at him, his mouth opening and closing, tears cutting tracks through the dirt on his cheeks. "Mikey," Elias rasped, You made General Sterling nodded, tears spilling over his own eyelids now, unashamed. I did, Elias, because of you, because you got the boys out. Because you told my mum the truth. Elias let out a sob, a sound that had been trapped in his chest since 1968, and leaned forward, resting his forehead against the general's shoulder, dirting the pristine service alpha shirt with the grime of the swamp. But Sterling didn't care. He wrapped his arms around the old man and held him tight, rocking him slightly, like a father holds a child, though in this moment the roles were reversed. I'm sorry, Elias wept into the uniform. I'm sorry I couldn't save him. I'm sorry. Sterling pulled back, gripping Elias's shoulders, looking him dead in the eye with a ferocity that demanded attention. Don't you ever apologize, Sterling said, his voice dropping to a command whisper. You gave me a life, Elias. You gave me a father I could be proud of. You are the only reason I know who I am. Rehook, you might think the emotional part is over, but remember Corporal Davis. He's still waiting outside, and the general is about to stand up. Sterling looked down at Elias's wrists, seeing the angry red welts left by the handcuffs, and the tenderness in his eyes instantly hardened into a cold, terrifying steel. He ran a thumb over the bruise. Who did this? Sterling asked, his voice quiet but vibrating with a dangerous frequency. Who put irons on you? Elias wiped his nose with his sleeve, sniffing. The boy, the corporal. He was just doing his job, Mikey. I was resisting. Sterling stood up, the movement fluid and powerful, pulling Elias up with him, supporting the old man's weight as his bad hip protested. No, Sterling said, his tone final. He wasn't doing his job. He was desecrating a monument. The general picked up the muddy flannel shirt that Davies had torn, trying to adjust it for Elias, brushing the dirt off the old man's chest. We are walking out of here, Elias, not as a prisoner, as my guest. Sterling put his arm around Elias's waist, taking the weight on his left side so Elias could limp comfortably. Can you walk? Elias nodded, finding strength he didn't know he had, fueled by the presence of the lieutenant's son. I can walk, sir. Force Recon never quits. They moved toward the open door, a strange pair, the immaculate general and the battered veteran, and stepped out into the hallway. The precinct had gone dead silent. Every MP, every clerk, every officer had stopped working and was standing against the walls, watching the scene unfold with wide eyes. At the end of the hall, near the intake desk, Master Sergeant Kowalski was standing at attention, and next to him, Corporal Davies looked like he was about to faint, his face the colour of old parchment, sweat beading on his upper lip. Davies saw them coming. He saw the general's arm around the trespasser. He saw the mud on the general's knees, the physical evidence of his submission to the veteran, and he knew, with a sickening certainty, that his life as he knew it was over. Sterling walked Elias right up to the desk, stopping 5 feet from Davies. He didn't yell, he didn't scream. He just stared. The silent treatment. It is a weapon used by senior officers that is far worse than a knife hand, because it forces the subordinate to sit in the vacuum of their own failure. The silence stretched for 10 seconds, then 20, becoming heavy and suffocating. Davies started to shake. Sir, Davies stammered, his voice a squeak. Sterling held up a hand, silencing him instantly. The general reached into his pocket and pulled out the evidence bag, the muddy flag. He placed it gently on the counter. Then he reached out and took the weapon, the garden trowel, and placed it next to the flag. Finally, he looked at Davies. Corporal, Sterling said, his voice echoing off the tile. Do you see this man? Davies couldn't look at Elias. He looked at his boots. Look at him! Sterling roared, the sudden volume making everyone jump. Davies snapped his head up, eyes locked on Elias. Yes, sir. This man, Sterling continued, his voice dropping back to a lethal calm, has more valor in his little finger than you have in your entire body. You dragged him through the mud. You handcuffed a hero on the grave of my father. The general stepped closer, invading Davy's personal space. You called this flag garbage. You called my father's resting place a landfill. Davies was crying now, silent tears of terror running down his face. I didn't know, sir. I swear. Sterling leaned in, his voice a whisper that carried across the room. Ignorance is not a defense, Corporal. Not in my Marine Corps. You failed the most basic test of a Marine. You failed to protect your own. If you live for moments where arrogance meets reality, this is why you're here. The bully is broken, but the punishment hasn't even started yet. Sterling turned to Master Sergeant Kowalski. Master Sergeant, unlock these doors. I want every Marine in this building to see this. He turned back to Elias. Sergeant Vance requires medical attention for his wrists and his hip. But first, Sterling looked at the muddy floor where Davies had dragged Elias in. Corporal Davies, you made a mess on my deck, and you made a mess of this man's dignity. The general paused, letting the weight of the moment settle. He wasn't going to send Davies to the brig. Not yet. That was too easy. He was going to give him a task that would haunt him. Elias, the general said, turning to the veteran, he's yours. What do you want to do with him? The room froze. The power had shifted completely. The trespasser now held the fate of the cop in his scarred hands. Elias looked at Davies. He saw the fear. He saw the youth. He saw the same look he had seen in the eyes of the replacements in 1968 who didn't know which way was north. Elias took a deep breath, wincing as his ribs flared with pain. He could have ended him. He could have demanded a court-martial. But Elias was a gardener. He believed in growth. He doesn't know the history, Mikey, Elias said softly. He thinks it's just dirt. Elias limped a step closer to Davies. He needs to learn the dirt. The general nodded, understanding immediately. Master Sergeant Kowalski, the general barked. Get a shovel, get a brush, and get this corporal a new uniform. He's going on a detail. Sterling looked at Davies. You're not going to the brig, son. You're going to Sector 4, and you're not leaving until every single stone in that abandoned cemetery is white as snow. And Sergeant Vance, the general smiled, a cold, hard smile. Sergeant Vance is going to supervise you, personally. Davies swallowed hard, realizing that his penance was going to be measured in sweat and mosquito bites. Yes, sir, Davies whispered. Thank you, sir. Sterling put his arm back around Elias. Let's go, Sergeant. I have a bottle of scotch in my office that's been waiting 50 years for you. As they walked out of the precinct, the Marines at the desk stood up and snapped to attention, not for the general, but for the old man covered in mud. Elias held his head high. The cuffs were gone. The weight was lifting. And the grave was about to get the best cleaning it had ever seen. The Georgia sun was hanging low in the sky, turning the swamp water of Sector 4 into a sheet of liquid gold. But for Corporal Davies, there was nothing beautiful about the afternoon because he was currently knee-deep in the same muck he had shoved Elias into just hours before. His pristine MP uniform, replaced by a set of borrowed coveralls that were already soaked through with sweat and swamp water. He wasn't holding a badge or a gun. He was holding a stiff, bristled brush and a bucket of soapy water, scrubbing the moss off a headstone that dated back to 1968, his arms burning with a lactic acid fire that felt like punishment, which of course it was, sitting nearby on a folding camp chair that the general's aide had brought out. Elias Vance watched him, sipping from a canteen of cold water, his bad leg propped up on a cooler, looking like a king holding court in the middle of a jungle. The general stood off to the side, arms crossed, silent as a statue, letting the NCO Elias run the show. You missed a spot, Corporal, Elias said, his voice calm, pointing with the tip of his cane to the bottom corner of the granite. The moss likes to hide in the crevices. You gotta dig it out. Respect the stone. Davies wiped the sweat from his eyes, his face streaked with dirt, and nodded, dropping back to his knees without a word of complaint. He could have destroyed him. He could have sat there and laughed while the kids suffered. But Elias isn't a bully, he's a teacher. And what happens next is the moment the boy becomes a man. Why are you doing this? Davies asked, his voice rasping, scrubbing harder at the stubborn lichen. Why didn't you just let the general court-martial me? I treated you like garbage. Elias took a slow sip of water, looking at the grave of Lieutenant Sterling, which was now gleaming white in the setting sun, restored to a dignity it hadn't seen in decades. Because throwing you in the brig teaches you fear, Elias said softly. But bringing you here, that teaches you history. Elias leaned forward, the cane digging into the soft earth. The man under that stone, Lieutenant Sterling, he was 24 when he died. He had a wife, he had a baby boy, he had a whole life ahead of him. Elias pointed at the general. That baby boy is standing right there, and the only reason he's standing there is because his father stood his ground in a rice paddy so I could get on a helicopter. Davis stopped scrubbing. He looked at the stone. Thomas Sterling, 1944 to 1968. He looked at the general. He looked at Elias. The dots finally connected in a way that wasn't just intellectual, it was emotional. He realized that the dirt he had disrespected was actually the foundation of the entire base. I'm sorry, Davies whispered, and this time it wasn't out of fear of rank. It was out of shame. I didn't see the man. I just saw the rules. Elias nodded. That's the trap, son. The rules are there to keep order. But the people are the mission. Never forget the mission. Elias stood up, wincing as his hip popped, and limped over to the grave. He took the small American flag, the one Davis had bagged as evidence, which had been cleaned and dried. He handed it to the corporal. Finish the job, Elias commanded. Plant the colours. Davies took the flag with trembling hands. He crawled over to the head of the grave. He smoothed the dirt. He placed the flag gently into the soft earth, making sure it stood straight and true. He stepped back and, without being told, snapped a slow, crisp salute to the stone. It wasn't a salute for an officer. It was a salute for a sacrifice. The general walked over, his boots crunching on the leaves. He put a hand on Davis' shoulder. Good work, Corporal. You're dismissed. Go get cleaned up. And Davis? Yes, sir. If I ever catch you looking at a veteran like he's a burden again, you'll be digging latrines in Alaska. Are we clear? Crystal clear, sir. Davis ran off toward the vehicle, a changed man, leaving the two old soldiers alone in the twilight. The general reached into his cargo pocket and pulled out a silver flask. He unscrewed the cap and poured a little splash onto the dirt of his father's grave. Then he handed it to Elias. To the tomahawk, the general whispered. Elias took the flask, his hand shaking slightly. To the tomahawk, he replied. He took a pull of the scotch. It burned, hot and clean, washing away the taste of the swamp. And to Mikey, Elias added, handing the flask back, looking the general in the eye. You did good, kid. You did good. The sun dipped below the tree line, casting long shadows over Sector 4. The crickets started to chirp. The ghosts were quiet. For the first time in 50 years. Elias didn't feel the weight of the debt. He felt light. He felt like he could finally go home and sleep without seeing the jungle. The general and the sergeant stood there for a long time, watching the flag flutter in the evening breeze. Two survivors of a war that ended a lifetime ago, bound together by blood and a promise kept. Listen to me closely. We live in a world that loves to put up fences. We put up fences around our bases, around our neighborhoods, and around our hearts. We label people trespassers or vagrants because it's easier than asking them their story. Corporal Davies made the mistake of seeing a fence and thinking his job was to keep people out. But Elias taught him that sometimes the most important duty is to open the gate. That grave in the woods wasn't abandoned. It was just waiting. It was waiting for the right people to remember it. And it took a pair of handcuffs and a massive mistake to bring a son back to his father. Never judge a book by its cover, and never judge a veteran by the mud on his boots. You have no idea what he had to walk through to get there.